welcome back to Sewing and Gaming. Previously, I made this slip. It'll be the first layer and first undergarment, I guess you could say, that I will be wearing as part of my Goblin King Ballroom Scene ball gown cosplay. Our next project for this cosplay is the corset.
To make this corset, I'm using pattern B4254 VUD from Ballroom. Just like with the slip pattern from before, I purchased a size that was too small. However, that can easily be fixed. Using the same method as before, I used paper to make the pattern pieces bigger. This time, not only did I add width to the pattern pieces, but I also added height. Since it's a corset, and therefore a supportive garment, I knew I needed to be able to have both support and coverage, even though it'll be covered up later by the outside layers. First, it was time for a quick stop to the ironing board to iron my muslin. Then it was time to begin cutting out all the pattern pieces. Since I adjusted the size of the pattern by guessing, I knew it would be wise to use muslin to make a mock-up of the corset. Then I would know where to adjust the fit, and I wouldn't be worried about using my good linen just yet. I was lucky that all of the pieces fit onto a mock-up from a different project, which meant that I didn't need to cut from a bigger piece of muslin. Next was going through all the pieces to cut notches and transfer markings. Now it's time to begin the construction of the mock-up. First, I stay stitched to the curve on the front piece, and then I attach the gusset piece to that same curve. I repeated the same step, putting in stay stitching and attaching a gusset piece, only this time I used the front middle piece. From here, I attached everything I had constructed so far. With the gussets in the middle, I sewed the front and middle front pieces together. The next step I did was attach the two pieces together down the front seam. While this step won't be done for the final corset, as this is where the corset busk will go in later, I did it on the mock-up to be able to help test the fit. The next pieces to get attached were the side front pieces, which got sewn onto the ends. Then it was time to move on to the back pieces. The middle back got sewn to the back, and then the side back got sewn to the middle back. Next, the front and back pieces got sewn together at the side seams. Finally, it was time for a fitting. Not only was the corset not tall enough, but it also ended up being too big and loose, and therefore overlapping in the back. Keeping a note of everything I needed to fix, it was time to take apart the mock-up, which meant I had some seam ripping ahead of me. Going back to my pattern pieces, I cut off the sides to make them skinnier. That would fix how loose the corset ended up being. To make the pieces taller, I taped them to the edge of a scrapbook of paper. Then I sketched vertical lines going up to extend each piece. Using my gusset piece as a guide, I drew in a horizontal line going across the top of each piece, before cutting everything out. When it came time to cut pieces for the second mock-up, I decided to reuse the fabric from earlier. First, I carefully repinned each pattern piece to the corresponding fabric cut. From there, I cut off the excess fabric from the sides. Then, doing the same as before, I placed the fabric pieces along the edge of another cut of fabric to extend each one. Everything was then cut to the new size. After adjusting my machine to a zigzag stitch, I sewed all the fabric extensions to the original fabric pieces. Then, reconstruct everything for a second mock-up, and it's time for another fitting. This time, the back doesn't meet up, but when everything is constructed correctly, with all the right parts, that will be fixed. With the second mock-up meeting my expectations, I was back to the ironing board to begin ironing all my good fabric. Then it was time to cut out all the different layers. The outside layer is linen, the interfacing layer is duck canvas, and the lining layer is more muslin. Before I could begin the construction of the corset, I needed to baste the linen and duck canvas layers together. With the right sides of the duck canvas facing up, I pinned and sewed the corresponding linen pieces in place.
The main pieces all sewn and attached together. The next step that the instructions call for are to attach the corset busks, so like the front hook and eye kind of thing. It kind of looks like that, but it's called a corset busk. So attach that to the facing, and then from there would attach the facing and the lining together, flip it right side out, base, and then put the boning in. However, I think I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to put in the boning to the lining first. So just attach it just to the lining, just not at the seams because it has specific placement, but attach the boning to the lining, and then I'll jump back to the step where you add in the corset busk, and then go from there.
To make sure I'm correctly placing all the boning pieces, I pulled out all the pattern pieces and laid out and pinned each one to the corresponding fabric section. Then I folded the pattern piece over along the line indicating the boning placement. Next, I used a simple pin to trace along the fold. With all the boning lines in place, it was time to cut all the boning channels and pieces. While this pattern called for 1/4 inch wide boning, I used 0.47 inch wide boning. Thankfully, there wasn't much trouble for me using boning that was nearly twice the width called for. Once all the boning channels were pinned in place, it was time to sew them all down. While normally it is recommended to take the boning out of the channels before sewing, I left them in. I typically tend to have too much trouble getting the boning back into the channels, so why take them out when I can still sew with them inside? All this meant was that I needed to use a zipper foot instead of the standard non-stick foot. The next step is preparing the center front of the corset for the corset busk. All that means is that I lay the busk on top of the lining and mark out with a pen where I need to make or leave holes or gaps. Then I use an awl to make the holes and follow that up with using fray check to keep the fabric from fraying. Now it's time to attach the lining to the outside of the corset. With right sides together, I pinned the center front pieces of the corset in place. The left front opening is sewn all the way down, while the right front opening is stitched together between the markings made earlier. To ensure the corset busk wouldn't fall out or move around, I hand-stitched the center front seam together at the edge, creating a channel that encased the bust. Then, flipping the corset so wrong sides were together, I pinned the edges of the corset pieces to each other. All of the edges were then basted in place. Before pinning and sewing down the bias tape to the edges, I trimmed down the seam. Then it was time to attach the bias tape. While the pattern called for attaching the bias tape via machine, I decided to go a different route. Since some of my boning was sticking to the seam allowance a little bit, I didn't want to worry about catching the boning while I attached the bias tape. Not to mention, I was concerned that it wouldn't be as clean looking as I would like. So I went with the more lengthy route and slip stitched all of the bias tape in place. Now we're finally getting close to the end. Next up is marking the spots to put in the grommets. These grommets will be helpful when using cording to lace up the back of the corset. With all the spots marked, it was time to begin making the holes and putting in the grommets. To start, I used my awl to start making all of the holes. Then I used my scissors to make each hole bigger. Once I had the correct size hole, I placed the grommets and used my grommet pliers to secure them in place. Then I went back later with fray check to go along the edges and ensure that fraying wouldn't happen. Using the pattern illustration as a guide, I grabbed my cording and began lacing up the back of the corset. I did have to cut the cording according to the pattern, as it calls for lacing the top half and the bottom half separately. To keep the cording from splitting and fraying, I used a lighter to melt the edges. Drawing on the corset, I used a pen to mark the spots I wanted to put hook and eye fasteners. I used a measuring tape to ensure they were all level. Then it was time to sew all the hooks in place.
And with that, the corset is complete. It took me about 90 minutes to do both mock-ups and the corset itself. The boning took some time, as well as the bias tape. It took me 4 hours just to do the bias tape. But I'm happy with how it turned out. I've got hooks here to be able to easily attach the petticoats in the different layers. Plus also, as I move and everything, they won't rotate around on me, so I can just hook the petticoat and the skirt in place and it will just stay all day. Next is the petticoat.